Today I'm going to talk about a topic that's very difficult, but is going to resonate with a lot of you. Our homes are supposed to be a place where we feel comfortable, at peace, and safe, but this is not true for many of us. Reports from across the globe show a surge in calls to emergency services regarding domestic abuse. We know that mistreatment of individuals increases during the holidays and when families spend more time together, which is exactly what's going on right now. Today I invited my fellow colleague, Mallory Mintzberg from the Menninger Clinic so we can talk about this topic. Mallory has extensive experience in working with survivors of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and trauma. Thank you so much for joining us, Mallory.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I'm really excited about talking about this because I feel like a lot of people can relate to it and benefit from it. But one of the first things that comes to my mind before we even jump into the topic about domestic abuse, I think it's important to talk about what it is. So can you share a little bit about how you would describe domestic abuse?
So I'm going to talk about and answer some of these questions. Unfortunately, we use a fairly heteronormative language, and so I might say husband, as that's fairly typical, but we know that women are abusers too, and men are survivors. And so it's important to clarify that while I might use this language, everyone is vulnerable and anyone can be a perpetrator. I think one of the most telling signs of an abusive relationship is fear of your partner. Now, domestic violence itself is a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship where one partner is trying to gain or maintain power and control over another person, typically through fear and intimidation, often including the threat or the use of violence. And so when we talk about domestic violence, there are several different kinds of violence. So you can have physical, emotional, spiritual, economic, sexual, all different kinds of abuse. So when we talk about physical violence, we talk about the use of force, hitting, kicking, shoving, things like that in order to control someone or control what they're doing. One of the types of abuse that gets passed over or missed pretty frequently is economic abuse. So that's where one person controls the majority of the money or won't put their partner on their bank account, and so they don't have access or knowledge about the financial situation of the family. Some things like that get missed pretty frequently. Spiritual abuse, I've talked to several survivors who have heard from their perpetrators that God wants them to stay, that part of their religion demands that they submit to their partner. All of these things and additional ones are ways that one partner tries to control the other person.
I think that was something that was really important that you talked about, because I feel like a lot of times survivors don't have the language to conceptualize what abuse may be. And oftentimes when we think about abuse, we only think about physical abuse. We don't consider how people can be abused emotionally, kind of what you talked about through finances or spiritually. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that as being a part of under the umbrella of what abuse encompasses. Why do people abuse their loved ones? I think a lot of people feel confused. You know, it seems like such like a counterintuitive thing to do when we love someone. We think about caring for them. We don't think about being abusive towards them.
Partners abuse their significant others or their intimate partners because they believe they have the right to control the person they're dating or the person they're with. Maybe the abusive partner thinks that they know best. Maybe they believe they should be in charge in the relationship. Maybe they think unequal relationships are ideal. Whatever it is, it's really important to always come back to that power and control and not be confused that it might be about jealousy or anger, no matter what a perpetrator might say.
I think right now survivors are in close quarters with their abusers. So they may feel like, I can't really reach out with my abuser being right next to me or in the next room. And in certain countries, it feels like distress calls can't be attended to because responders are being stretched in multiple different directions. And kind of what you alluded to earlier, many survivors can be financially dependent on their abusers. So what is something that someone can do in this type of a scenario or situation?
This is such a tricky question because of the current situation in the world right now. Lots of people are stuck at home. Like you said earlier, Unfortunately, some of the best options that we can provide to people are things like safety planning. So I talk a lot with survivors about what can they do in their home right now. So for example, I have survivors who have young kiddos who cry and they know that their perpetrator gets really upset about that. And so we talk to survivors about, all right, maybe your kid needs to be asleep before your husband gets home. Maybe, your kiddo needs to be in the other room before your wife, comes home, anything like that. We typically talk to parents about having code words with their kids, but also code words with their neighbors. So calling someone and saying the code word, letting them know that if I say this, you need to call 911. Additionally, we talk to survivors about de-escalation. Fortunately, it should never be the responsibility of their survivor to de-escalate a situation that's about to get violent. But in this current atmosphere, we end up needing to do that. So if you can de-escalate a situation in a safe way that you feel comfortable with, then we really suggest that. We talk to them about staying with other family members, creating emergency bags. So making sure that documents, important papers, important items are all in a bag that's easy to get or is hidden away to grab if you need to go quickly. I know that emergency calls are coming fast and furious, but hotlines are available. I know the Houston Area Women's Center, their hotline is open 24/7. I know they are also taking in people at their emergency shelters. So it's difficult and it's challenging, but if the situation arises where you need to leave, we always suggest leaving.
I think what you talked about using code words, I actually saw this a little bit earlier. One of the psychologists that I know, she posted this on her Facebook, that if someone is facing domestic abuse right now, to message her saying that that they're interested in buying a bar of homemade soaps, and that for her is code word to know that this person is going through domestic abuse. And also writing in the message, I'm interested in making this purchase, and here's my address, you can ship it to this place. So that way she has the information to be able to call 911 and let them know where this person lives, and that way that they can receive help if that's the only thing that they can actually do. So oftentimes abusers use gaslighting as a way to make the survivor believe that maybe they deserve the treatment that they're getting, or that the treatment, like the abuse, is their fault.
So basically gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which a person, the perpetrator, sows seeds of doubt in an individual, making them question their own memory, question their perception, or their judgment. Typically, perpetrators use denial, misdirection, contradiction, misinformation. All of those are attempts to delegitimize a victim's belief. All of that is, again, in order to exert more power and control. So, for example, if a survivor thinks that a perpetrator has hit them, a perpetrator might say something like, "I barely touched you," or "What are you talking about?" They might outright lie about it. And all of that is to make sure that the survivor isn't quite sure about what's happening. And so when they go, they might be less willing to reach out for help because they're not sure what kind of help they might receive. The perpetrator might accuse the survivor of abusing them, making it seem that, well, if you hadn't yelled at me or you're always pushing me, it can make survivors really confused and not sure exactly what's happening. Again, all of that to exert more power and control in the relationship.
So many times it's not just one individual who is in the home where there's domestic abuse happening. Oftentimes there are kids also. So what can we do if we're worried about our kids' safety?
Yeah, so frequent exposure to violence in the home for those kids, predisposes kids to numerous social and physical problems, but it also teaches them that violence is a normal way of life. Unfortunately, this predisposes them to become the next generation survivors or abusers themselves. So what we really want to make sure is that we're protecting our kiddos in those situations. And yeah, I do go back to some of the same things: safety planning, code words with kiddos. Unfortunately, for a lot of our kids like this, school is a safe place. And so without that option, it's a really scary time. And so right now, when things are so unusual and so surreal, the option that is available is doing what's necessary. So if that's hiding kids when the perpetrator is upset, leaving if necessary, anything that you can do to make sure that those kids stay safe.
Sometimes it feels like people who are faced with abuse are the ones being held accountable. You talked about how abusers may use gaslighting as a way to do that, kind of putting it on them. Well, if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have hit you. And I have personally seen this. Survivors who've actually successfully left abusive relationships, I've seen that oftentimes people, especially if they're women who are survivors, people view them in a negative light rather than seeing them as someone who was strong and resilient and got out of that abusive relationship.
Yeah, this is such similar rhetoric to what I hear when we talk about sexual assault survivors or rape prevention, right? Is that we need to be teaching women how to avoid dark alleys or not to drink too much at a party or things along that line. And what really needs to happen is changing the narrative to make perpetrators responsible. Talking about how we teach perpetrators to be different, how we teach people to handle conflict and deal with their anger in a way that is not about controlling someone else. And unfortunately, the only person that can prevent domestic violence is the perpetrator.
Most of the time we think of women as being people who experience domestic abuse, but what about men?
The statistics about domestic violence actually do sort of include men, that 1 in 4 men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. That's a huge portion of the men in this country. Perpetrators of domestic violence against male victims include female and male intimate partners, as well as caregivers against or caregiver abuse against elderly or disabled male victims. And the problem with male domestic violence is societal assumptions and prejudices about what constitutes manhood. They're largely responsible for male violence, but they also impact how we see and respond to male victims. So male victims face the added barrier of not being believed, being ridiculed when they try to report. Additionally, stereotyping of what male victimhood or manhood and the stigmas attached to it increase the sense of shame and often make it more difficult for men to report and make them more reluctant to report. So we see that there are social attitudes that men should be strong and invulnerable. Those types of attitudes typically influence our support systems like the police or the judicial or the medical systems, again, placing more barriers for men to report and receive help. Oftentimes these attitudes re-trigger or re-traumatize those survivors as well.
How can we during this time utilize the help of our friends or neighbors?
So something that we know about domestic violence is that survivors try to leave their abusers on average 9 times before they are able to leave for good. And so I am always really clear with friends or family of victims or survivors of domestic violence. It doesn't do any good to berate them or shame them, because that's something that a lot of perpetrators tell their victims. What victims or survivors need is support and options, not guilt and shame. And so it's important to check on the people that you know might live in a home where domestic violence occurs. It's important to offer a compassionate, non-judgmental ear. Be someone that they can come to over and over again. Let them know that there are hotlines open and that there are shelters taking survivors. But at the end of the day, a survivor has to make that decision for themselves.
Well, thank you so much, Mallory, for sharing all of this fruitful information. I think it's going to be very beneficial for a lot of people during these times. And I hope that through watching this video, they're able to feel more empowered, even though we are kind of isolated and this time presents a lot more challenges. I think it's helpful to have this information because it helps give people some tools that they can utilize.
Wonderful. I was happy to be here. Thanks so much for talking about this topic.
What I want survivors to know during these times is that you are not alone. There are resources that you can utilize. If you found this information to be helpful, make sure to share, like, and subscribe so you can benefit someone who may need it. I'll see you in the next one.